Good afternoon. We are going to start this press conference. Welcome, everyone. We have just come from the Climate Ambition Summit, an unprecedented summit in the international context, where the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres challenged and welcomed countries to commit to incredibly important fossil fuel plans. In particular, fossil fuel phase-out plans and commitments to no new fossil fuels. This is an unprecedented moment in our climate framework. Neither the UNFCCC or the Paris Agreement recognize fossil fuels. So today, UN Secretary General has broken a barrier, if you will, a glass ceiling. And we heard from incredible leaders this morning about their commitments. We also saw that certain countries were not in the room, including the United States. We have an incredible panel today of civil society leaders as well as government officials and leaders. And with that, I will start with their reactions. First, we will have Ambassador Adow from Vanuatu.
Thank you. Last year, Vanuatu became the first country to call for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty at the UN General Assembly. This year, we return with the backing of our fellow Pacific nations, the European Parliament, the World Health Organization, and thousands of scientists and experts globally to develop a comprehensive multilateral framework that addresses climate change at its source, a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. Early this year, Vanuatu and a core group of states also spearheaded the effort to secure a request for an advisory opinion on climate change from the International Court of Justice. The resolution making this request was adopted by consensus and garnered over 130 co-sponsors. This case is currently pending before the ICJ, but holds the promise to drive further climate action through the clarification of the legal obligations states owe to address the climate crisis under the international law, and further what the legal consequences of failing to do so means for states. As we speak, there is also another climate advisory opinion proceeding happening before the International Tribunal of the Law of the Sea. This advisory opinion request asks the tribunal to clearly and objectively state what the legal duties of states parties under the Law of the Sea Convention in relation to the impact of climate change on the marine environment from greenhouse gas emission. In this vein of developments in international law, Vanuatu is also a proponent of amending the Rome Statute to include ecocide. What is ecocide? It means the unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there is a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment being caused by those acts. We thank the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres for convening today's summit as a platform for continued climate ambition, and we look forward to hearing from all countries on their ambitions and announcement. We could also use more ambition now, especially for our climate and our people. We urge you all to encourage our governments to join this movement and spur on our collective action. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Adow. And I'm sorry for also not introducing myself. My name is Jean Sue. I am with the Center for Biological Diversity, as well as Climate Action Network International. Next, we have the actress, Jane Fonda.
Thank you very much, and I think we all have to applaud the UN Secretary General for thrusting fossil fuels into the limelight of the climate conversation and forcing countries to respond as to whether they're going to phase out fossil fuels as climate science demands in order to avoid the worst case climate catastrophe. I am so excited about what my state, the great state of California, what my governor, Gavin Newsom, has declared. He was there today on the floor to speak, to announce his landmark lawsuit against big oil to hold polluters accountable. He says The climate crisis is a fossil fuel crisis. The big oil companies have been lying to us for decades. He is going to sue them for that and the damage they have done and hold them accountable. And he has also signed climate disclosure bills so that any company that makes $1 billion or more a year has to disclose what their carbon emissions are. As leader of the world's 5th largest economy and major oil-producing state, Governor Newsom's announcements demonstrate true climate leadership, and I applaud him with all my heart. This leadership is sorely absent at the top of most major oil and gas producing countries, especially the United States. The people of the United States, in vast majority, 70% of them, understand that the climate crisis is alarming. They are concerned. On Sunday, there was a march here in New York of 75,000 people demanding an end to fossil fuels. Why can't our leaders hear this? Something happened today. I don't know if I'm supposed to say this, but for the first time, we all think it's the first time ever in the history of the United Nations, that John Kerry, someone representing the United States at the top level, was refused the request to speak. He did not speak. John Kerry, who is President Biden's emissary on the climate crisis, says we can't stop using fossil fuels because it will leave too many countries behind. We have to rely on carbon capture. This is ridiculous. I mean, I'm just an actress in Hollywood, and I can know this is ridiculous. Carbon capture is a technology that has never really been proved. It will be expensive. It will allow the continuing use of fossil fuels. We can help the countries in the global south and others who have difficulty totally transitioning to a green economy, a green energy source. We can make that possible. If you take the $4 trillion subsidies that fossil fuel companies are given, we can use that to help other countries make the transition to green energy, and we must do it. It is tragic that the leadership is missing at the top of the most major gas and oil producing countries. The U.S., I am sorry to say, is the world's largest oil and gas producer, the #1 gas exporter, and accounts for 1/3 of all planned oil and gas expansion until 2050. Emissions from President Biden's exports will undermine the benefits of his recent climate bill, boosting renewable energy deployment, the Inflation Reduction Act, it was called. Biden's rubber stamping of all these projects will continue to cook the planet and poison our environmental justice communities from the site of extraction to combustion. And that's why we are asking the United States to lead on ending the era of fossil fuels. Biden should stop approving new fossil fuel development. He should phase out existing production on our public lands and waters. He must end all subsidies and declare a climate emergency to turbocharge our renewable energy future. Listen to us, President Biden. Your legacy is on the board. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. There's applause in the audience. Thank you so much, Jane, for your moral clarity on these issues. Next, we have Tzeporah Berman, who is the chair of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty.
Thank you, Jean. I didn't realize I was going to have to be going after Jane Fonda today, but...
well, I didn't want to go after you. That's why I moved here.
There is no question today was a turning point. We have waited more than 30 years for our leaders to tackle the root causes of the fires, the floods, and the heat waves that are sweeping our planet and taking lives and livelihoods, the expansion of oil, gas, and coal. Up until this week, the fossil fuel industry had made their products, oil, gas, and coal, invisible and have been exerting influence to weaken the global approach to climate change. That stops now. For the first time, industry has been dragged center stage and exposed for being the heart of the problem. Today, we heard the Honorable Natano, Prime Minister of Tuvalu, call on other leaders to join him in seeking a mandate to negotiate a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty that would ensure an end to expansion of oil, gas, and coal projects and cooperation on a plan for a managed wind-down that is fast, fair, and financed. Vanuatu and 5 other Pacific Island nations have already joined Tuvalu in calling for a global fossil fuel treaty because they know that today we are on track to produce 110% more oil, gas, and coal by 2030 than we can ever burn and stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius, because they know that the majority increase in production is from wealthy countries, and specifically the United States and also Canada. These Pacific Island nations will be joined by more countries before the end of the year. Support for a new fossil fuel treaty to manage an equitable wind down of production, to negotiate who gets to produce and how much, and how countries can cooperate to support even the producer countries beginning to manage a decline of fossil fuel production in line with the science, in line with what's safe. That movement is growing. This week, the Climate Group here at Climate Week endorsed the treaty. WWF, Global Citizens, all joining 2,000 other organizations from around the world, including the World Health Organization and more than 100 cities. This month, California, the 5th largest economy in the world, passed a motion to support the fossil fuel treaty. Some say that this proposal is too bold, that it's too ambitious. But we know that we cannot afford more of the same. If there is just one message this summit sends to those countries claiming to be climate leaders but who continue to expand oil, gas, and coal projects, it's that this deadly hypocrisy is no longer acceptable. This year is the turning point in having an honest global conversation. The oil companies acknowledged this year that they will not meet their bogus net zero commitments. The data showed us that their carbon capture plans are not working at scale to abate fossil fuel projects, and even more incriminating data calls into questions credits and offsets around the world. The science is calling for absolute emissions and production decline now of fossil fuels, and we have the technology today to replace most fossil fuel uses, and we know it's cheaper, and we know it's safer, and it will save lives. Today, 1 in 5 people die on the planet because of air pollution from fossil fuels alone. We can, and we will, build a coalition of countries designing a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty to stop the expansion and ensure an equitable wind down that is fast, fair, and financed. The fossil fuel industry won't be invited to the negotiating table. It's clear that they will not manage their own decline. They have manipulated climate negotiations for decades and lied to us. It's time to stop negotiating with them and start regulating them. Finally, as a Canadian, I have to mention that I was embarrassed today, with record fires sweeping across my country, that Canada was called out for being one of the largest expanders of fossil fuels last year by the chair of the United Nations at the Climate Ambition Summit. Prime Minister Trudeau has taken action to address fossil fuel subsidies, but continues to allow new oil, fracking, and LNG projects. It's not a transition if they continue to grow the problem. After sustained pressure from civil society, Prime Minister Trudeau finally promised to announce Canada's plans to cap emissions from the oil and gas sector by the end of this year. This comes after multiple delays, and he did not respond to the facilitator's question about aligning the sector with the 1.5 trajectory. This is a critical moment in history. This was the hottest year on record. It was the hottest summer on record, and people today are experiencing the impacts that fossil fuels and the growth of fossil fuel production and emissions have created. We need to act now, and we need our elected officials to recognize that they have to cooperate to ensure that we have a livable planet. Thank you.
Thank you, Tzeporah, for those inspirational words. We are now going to shift to a second group of speakers, but our speakers, please do not move. First, we are, oh, you, they totally can't. We're also gonna shift here. Okay, yes, if you could, if you feel comfortable moving, please do, but if not, that's okay as well. We now have Mohamed Adow, Romain Lillian, and Briana Fuan to come up on stage. Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador. And our speakers will be available afterwards for questions. So I'd like to first turn it to Mohamed Adow with PowerShift Africa.
Thank you so much, Jane. I must say, for decades, those of us who live on the front line of climate change have been demanding, particularly the historic polluters, to tackle climate change. And our language has shifted so that we can actually address the root cause of the problem. And for 35 years of international climate negotiations, we've avoided the elephant in the room, fossil fuels. And what Guterres, through this Climate Ambition Summit, has offered the world is an opportunity for us not to just address the symptoms, but actually go after big oil, coal and gas, so that we can be able to phase out fossil fuels and rapidly phase in renewables, and in the process address the energy poverty that the world is facing. There's no denying that the energy transition is going to be a daunting challenge, but it's also a huge opportunity with potential to transform our global economy and our global society. Now, I want you to imagine an industrial revolution that is not built on the backs of slavery, that is not built on exploited labor, but on innovation that allows us to be able to tap the sunshine, the wind, the hydropower, and the geothermal power that exists across the world. One that can actually unlock abundant, clean energy for the billions of the people on this planet who so much need it. If we can ensure this revolution is one that actually helps us tap the incredible renewable energy potential that exists, we will not actually have the revolution that allowed part of the world to develop on the backs of the poor, and in the process caused a climate crisis. We're in the midst of a climate emergency, and we need to start acting like it. And what Guterres, the UNSG Secretary General, has actually offered us is his convening power and his rhetorical force. And I think as a global community, we need to applaud the UN Secretary General. Oftentimes, international diplomacy, has overly been conducted in a very polite manner. And what we've seen now is a Secretary General who is happy not to pull punches, and that, for a politician, is effectively withdrawing the mic. We know how much they love the mic and the world stage to be able to actually sell us their pitiful offering. And this strategy that the UN Secretary General has employed in New York this time is effectively deny the mic to every country that has nothing to offer. Now they have to earn the right to speak to the world by actually offering more credible, more ambitious, climate action. There's two parts to the climate challenge. One is us effectively stop digging oil, coal, and gas. The second part is for us to actually deal with the impact that the world is facing. We now face inevitable impact of climate change. Parts of the global south, and particularly the least developed countries, the small island states, are facing climate impact that exceeds their coping mechanism. And last year in Sharm el-Sheikh, the world agreed a loss and damage fund. And we need to bring that through so that we can offer assurance to the countries on the front line that when their coping mechanisms are exceeded, the international community will show up and be able to provide them the support they so much need. And that part of the equation, we didn't hear enough commitment, particularly from the leaders. And I think it's an opportunity for them to look back and realize there's only one way for the world. And that way is going to only be realized if we can be able to offer global solidarity so that the poorest and the most vulnerable who have contributed the least to the climate problem are going to be offered the opportunity to build their resilience and on the back of that resilience be able to transition. I come from the continent of Africa. 600 million of us don't have electricity. The whole continent consumes less electricity than the city of New York. So a continent of 55 countries, 1.4 billion people consumes less electricity, less energy than the city of New York. 600 million Africans don't have electricity. 1 billion Africans don't have access to clean cooking. And that continent is also incredibly blessed with renewable energy. And so we're effectively choosing to chart a different path, a path that will help avoid Africa joining the league of big polluters. But to help harness that potential, the rich world will need to actually share finance and technology in a more generous way than they shared the COVID patent when we faced the COVID pandemic. We're dealing with an existential crisis, and we need all hands on deck, and we need the international community to realize parts of the world that haven't contributed to the problem and have majority of the population poor can actually contribute to the solution by leapfrogging. But they can't do that without finance, and they can certainly not do that without clean technology. What we want is for the international community to actually offer the support so that we can be able to contribute to solve the problem. None of us can afford to sit out of the climate solutions that are so much needed. And that is the opportunity the continent of Africa, through His Excellency President Ruto, had offered. We didn't cause the climate problem. We want to contribute to the solutions. But to do that, we need to reform the international financial institutions so that we can be able to reduce the cost of capital and allow the developing countries, including those in Africa, to be able to leapfrog that energy and become green leaders. There's an opportunity for Africa to become a renewable energy superpower and contribute to the new green revolution. But that won't be realized if we don't reform the way the governance, particularly of the international financial institutions, are organized so that we can reduce the cost of capital and be able to offer the best opportunity to these developing countries. And I hope through the IMF and World Bank meeting that are coming to Africa for the first time in 50 years in the city of Marrakesh in October will actually help make that happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohamed, for the clear-eyed perspectives about global politics. Next, we have Briana Fuan, who is a Pacific climate warrior and youth climate justice activist.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. This morning was actually my first time in the UN building. It was my first time being in a General Assembly space. And I sat there and I was watching everyone, and it kind of reminded me of a mock UN we did when I was in primary school. And it reminded me of the lessons from my teachers from when I was really young. And the three main lessons they always told us: be kind to your classmates, your neighbors, clean up after yourself, and be careful with your words. This morning, once again, I was reminded, and I hope everyone was reminded, the importance of words. In Samoan, we have a proverb called "E pala ma'a aile pala upu." It means that even stones decay, but words do not. It is a lesson in the importance of language, of what you say. Ambition was the word that underlined the convening this morning at the Climate Ambition Summit. Yet it's not something we saw from everyone, including the US head of state who was not present. We did, though, see ambition from Chile, California, and Tuvalu, who named the culprit that we've been waiting to hear: fossil fuels. Oil, gas, and coal. It is critical that we hear those words in these spaces. How can we talk about the fight against climate change if we're not naming who we're fighting? Words are important. It is words that literally can mean the sinking or the surviving of our islands. Pacific Islanders don't want to move. That's a big misconception. The Western world will tell us that climate change is an opportunity for us to come and live in the West. We don't want to live here. Our elders for years have said that they will go down with our islands. I have markings on my body, my tatau, and it is believed that it is our connection to the land. We use the nut from one of our indigenous trees to make the ink, and it is believed that you carry Samuel with you. And when it's your time to go, you'll be buried back in the land, and you'll return the ink to the land. It is something we live in reciprocity with. It is something that cannot be removed from us. We are the land. Words are important because they mean that this could be taken away from us. So let's name the industry that might just take this right away from me. Let's call a spade a spade. Let's call the fossil fuel industry out, and let's save my islands. Thank you.
Thank you, Brianna. And next we have Romain Ioualalen, which I totally have butchered, and he is with Oil Change International.
You didn't butcher it. Good morning. I'm Romain Ioualalen. I work for Oil Change International. We're part of a network of organizations called the Global Gas and Oil Network. It's a global network of around 300 organizations that fight fossil fuel expansion and fight for a just and equitable phase out of fossil fuel production around the world. Today was interesting. I don't always say that about UN summits, but today was really interesting. And in many respects, it was a tale of two summits. The first summit is the summit of those who were not invited. And I think it's been said and said again by other speakers. Obviously, the US was not invited to the summit, but they were not the only one, not by a long stretch. We're also missing the UK, Australia, Norway, and the UAE, the COP28 president in charge of the global climate negotiations this year, did not make the cut for a global climate summit, which I think is very telling about the situation we're facing collectively. And what do these countries have in common with Canada? We published a report last week called Planet Records that looks at the projected oil and gas expansion between now and 2050. And these 5 countries, Canada, US, Australia, Norway, and the UK, collectively account for more than half of the CO2 that's going to be emitted between now and 2050 from new oil and gas production that we know is not compatible with respecting the Paris Agreement and limiting climate change. So it's not surprising that these countries were not invited, because they're the worst offenders when it comes to fossil fuel expansion. And to make it worse, they're the countries that should be leading in phasing out fossil fuel production. They're the countries that have the financial means, they have the historical responsibility to be phasing out fossil fuels and to stop supporting a dying industry. But they're not doing that. They're not doing that, and it's not surprising that they were not invited today. And we have to really commend the UN Secretary General for holding the line on that, because that's not an easy thing to do, and I assume they were under a lot of pressure. The other summit is the summits of those who actually made the cut, who actually showed up, and there was tremendous amount of leadership on display at this summit this morning. We heard from Pacific countries calling for global phase-out of fossil fuels and battling the impacts of climate change on a daily basis and fighting for their survival. We heard from a number of presidents, prime ministers, state governors calling out the fossil fuel industry for driving the climate crisis, for being at the heart of the cascade of catastrophes that we've faced since the start of the year, and in many regions for years or even decades. And so, we've heard, Kenya talking about the aspiration of African countries to leapfrog towards a clean development pathway. And so, really, it's striking that the leadership that's coming, or that was on display at the summit, is primarily coming from global South countries. And that's a disgrace. That's a shame. It's really shameful for countries, for the 5 countries in particular that I quoted, to not make the cut and to leave the burden of climate leadership to those who are not responsible for this. So that's where we are today. And now where do we go from here, basically, because that's what matters. We have 2 months until COP28 in Dubai, where countries will need to agree on a phase out of fossil fuels. That's the thing that the world expects from this climate conference. Hundreds of thousands of people have mobilized around the world over the past few weeks. There were 75,000 people marching for fossil fuel phase out in New York just a few days ago. And so if countries are not able to come together in Dubai to enact the end of the fossil fuel era, then we will have, then the UN system will have bigger problems on its hand and will lack credibility. So we really urge countries to find a way to find an agreement in Dubai and to work really hard and go back to a drawing board at the national and international level to make sure that what we saw today is not replicated in 2 months in Dubai. Thank you.
Thank you, Romain. We did want to take a moment to give tremendous thanks to Ambassador Adow and Vanuatu and Tuvalu for hosting this press conference today and actually allowing for your voices and civil society voices to be heard with a mic at the United Nations. I think it's also so important to recognize that Ambassador Adow, Vanuatu, and Tuvalu and all the Pacific nations have been the leaders for decades asking for fossil fuels to stop and for the world and huge emitters like the United States, Britain, other huge oil and gas producers to take leadership and stop our fossil fuel economy. They have been at the forefront at that, and we support that. Over this last weekend, over 700 actions took place around the world, all asking in solidarity with Vanuatu, Tuvalu, and Pacific Island nations to end fossil fuels. And just this last Sunday, all of that escalated into 75,000 people in the United States demanding President Biden lead that charge as the #1 oil and gas producer in the world. This is a historic moment where we have grassroots groups and people finally in solidarity with our island nation states. And we are meeting with the UN Secretary General, the Chief of the United Nations, from the top, also asking and demanding that an end to fossil fuels is committed to. So from the bottom up and top down, we are meeting an historic precedent, and we are hoping and urging that that will shake loose our biggest oil and gas producers in the world to make the U-turn that we need to save our planet. With that, I'd like to open this up to questions. Do we have questions from the audience? And if Jane, Tzeporah, and Ambassador Adow can please come to the stage as well, we'd very much appreciate that to get different voices up. Maybe you can stand up and then they can sit and we will get some questions here. Apologies for the for our infrastructure constraints. Do we have any questions from the audience or online? Yes.
Well, I think the negotiations and the discussions are going on at the moment. I think the challenge will be how to capitalize the funds, to provide the funds. I think that would be the major challenge. And it will come down mainly to the rich and powerful countries to provide those funds. I know Vanuatu was the first country to call for these loss and damage funds when they were chairing the AOCs way back in the early 90s. They were calling for this fund. But back then there was no political appetite for this type of funds. So the negotiations are going on, but we will know exactly the answer when it comes to COP28. But there are discussions within the AOCs as well as other major players regarding the fund. And there is a transitional committee that was set up to discuss this fund. So we will know the exact answer during COP28.
The biggest challenge we have with the loss and damage fund is the US. US wants to avoid any liability, even though the world following the pressure from the most vulnerable countries in COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, we'd agreed to set up a loss and damage fund. In the last talks in the Dominican Republic, the US started walking back on those commitments and making difficult the whole process around establishing the fund. But it's not going to happen. The world has agreed to establish a fund, the fund will be there. The next thing that follows is whether they will capitalize. And our call to the US and to President Biden is for him to recognize the climate harms, the historic polluters have caused, and to provide every support to the vulnerable countries to be able to actually deal with those inevitable impacts that we can no longer be able to adapt to. It's an important acknowledgement in the UNFCCC after nearly 35 years of negotiations that we're now hearing the cries of the vulnerable countries and working to establish a loss and damage fund. But a fund without the capital will not go far enough to actually help support the most vulnerable nations. And I think we must get a clear signal out of Dubai. Just like we need a phase out of fossil fuels, we need to be able to actually operationalize the fund. And those two things are the demands of the world, as we've made clear.
Thank you. Yes.
Caitlin Hu from CNN. For the ambassador, please. The Climate Ambition Summit, did you think it was ambitious enough? I mean, we've heard praise of it, we've heard some other comments, but was it enough? Would you have structured it differently? And then separately, do you have any comment about the changes announced by UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak today about rolling back some of the environmental measures that the UK had committed to? This includes delaying a ban on sales of petrol and diesel cars and allowing other exemptions within the UK for people to move more slowly towards climate goals.
Well, in terms of the climate ambition, I think, like our previous speaker, they mentioned that what we need is action. And we've been discussing this ambition for many, many years, and we have seen that the IPCC report has always given us a fail report. It gave us a F grade, which means we are failing. So that is the challenge. So we are at the point where we have to be acting urgently to discuss this climate crisis. Like they were saying today, the Secretary General mentioned that it's not about climate warming anymore. We are climate boiling. So that's the challenge that we are facing at the moment. So there is a lot of discussions about commitments of states, what they want to do to curb emissions, to provide more finance. But these are more voluntary, on a voluntary basis, and it depends on states to do that. And we depend on the goodwill of states. And so this will take time. And it has shown in the past that we still have a gap. But we are still fighting with nature. We're still fighting with the climate. So I think there's more work for us to do. And I think we are at the point where we are at the crisis point where we have to do more. As you can see, I'm a diplomat, so I will have to speak diplomatically. And in terms of the UK's announcement, I think, like some of our speakers will say, they are a global player. They are a major player here in the Security Council. They are a permanent six. They are some of the main founders of the United Nations. I think one thing that is important for UK is to have more ambition in terms of curbing the greenhouse gas emissions, as well as in their own action in terms of providing finance. So I think it's very important for them to have to display global moral leadership, and so other countries, other powerful countries, should also do that.
If I may add to that, to the UK, how far the UK has fallen when it comes to climate leadership. That country was the first country to have a net zero target in law. It was the first country to end international public finance for fossil fuels. It was, until very recently, COP26 host, and displayed a significant level of ambition back then. But it's also, I think it shows that it's all of that is, hidden or was concealing the fact that the UK is still a major producer of oil and gas, and has no intention to stop, actually. And the current government has said it again and again, that they have no intention of ending oil and gas expansion in the North Sea. And now they're rolling back, measures to decrease the consumption of fossil fuels. So it's very striking that one of the countries that has the highest historical responsibilities when it comes to CO2 emissions and for the climate crisis is actually walking away from that responsibility and not following science anymore. So it's at least from the point of view of civil society from around the world, we're really profoundly concerned about what's happening in the UK, and it's really a sign that that science doesn't seem to be listened to anymore with the UK government.
Thank you. Other questions from the floor? Yes.
You hear me okay? Okay, good. Rachel Ramirez, also with CNN. My colleague Caitlin just asked the previous question. I was actually curious, Ambassador Adow, if you could comment on this kind of growing momentum on seeking for an advisory opinion at the ICJ. You know, Vanuatu just won a big victory earlier this year, and now I'm seeing Prime Ministers in Tuvalu and also the Antigua and Barbuda kind of go up to international stage again with this advisory opinion. I was wondering if you can comment on that and also kind of give us a specific maybe timeline and kind of what success looks like for you.
Well, thank you for your question. I think in terms of the ICJ and the ITLOS advisory opinion that Vanuatu is spearheading, along with a core group of countries, 18 countries, and this year, March 29, we have adopted the resolution by consensus. So that was a major diplomatic victory in terms of not only smaller countries and the grassroots movement, but also for the world, for all member countries of the UN. But what we are hoping to do is to clarify the international law with respect to the impacts of climate change, but also we are hoping that it will increase more climate ambition, not replacing the Paris Agreement, but increase more climate ambition, but also the responsibilities of the state in terms of their ambition. So we are hoping that we can get a favorable advisory opinion, and we can use that, and it will have far outreaching consequences. So as soon as the ICJ make their pronouncements in terms of the advisory opinion, it will have major ramifications on international law. So this is something that it will be huge globally if it is favorable. Well, we have asked for like January, and then the discussions will start at the ICJ and the proceedings around January, and then it will, and then the oral hearings after 1 or 2 months after that. So it's on the ICJ website, the timetable for the ICJ proceedings. So you can find that on the ICJ website. In terms of the ITLOS, the hearing is currently ongoing. So this is the second week. The International Tribunal Law of the Sea is hearing the ITLOS case. So both of them will have a huge impact on international law.
Thank you, Jinsu. I just want to make one comment on the UK President's Prime Minister's speech. I understand the British Prime Minister has just given a speech in London which will water down his government's net zero commitments. And this seems to be the final nail in the coffin for the UK government as an international climate leader. You cannot lead credibly on climate change while proposing to issue licenses for new oil and gas production. And we understand that for producing countries, the commitment to stop expansion and manage a wind down of production and emissions is not going to be an easy one. But by approving new projects, they make it more difficult every day. And that's why, especially for producing countries in the global south, we're going to need international cooperation to manage the wind down in line with the science and to keep people safe. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any final questions from the audience? Okay, with that, would everybody like to give one final statement for the press, beginning with you, Ambassador?
Well, we have been talking a lot. The next COP will be COP28, so there's still a lot of talk, so we need to act right now to stop this, like what the Secretary General was saying, climate boiling.
There are over 24 liquefied natural gas terminals in the Gulf region of the United States, Texas and Louisiana, that the Biden administration is permitting. All of this LNG is for export, even though they justify it by saying national security. So given that this is an international body, I just want to urge everybody on the receiving end, the countries that are going to be receiving, let's see you protesting. Let's see you declaring you don't want this, to help remove the justification of what the Biden administration is doing. And climate activists in the United States are doing all we can to expose what's happening in the hopes of shutting it down. Because if this goes forward, this will become the #1 carbon bomb in the world. So help us on the other end to get this ended. Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to echo or remind everyone of something that the Secretary General said this morning, which was, one meeting won't save the world. We've had more than one meeting. We've had more than several decades of COP. We've had several decades of press conferences. And so what's got to change? Where's the line? And I think that the line is here. I think we're at it right now. And so I encourage everyone to not think of this as just step one. This is not step one. It's been a long journey, especially for Pacific Islands, especially for islands countries who have been leading the charge. And so let's keep moving forward, and let's stop thinking that this is just one meeting. It's not one meeting. It's a culmination of many.
Every year we meet and our leaders meet and they give incredible moving speeches about the climate emergency and the impacts around the world. And then every year the data comes out and we wonder why we're failing to constrain emissions in a way that will keep people safe. Yet every year we're approving more and more and more oil and gas and coal projects and then wondering why we can't meet our targets. There has been a missing piece in the climate negotiations for 30 years. And that stops now. We're finally having the right conversation. This conversation will take courage. It will take courage from our elected leaders to stand up to the most powerful lobby on earth. The fossil fuel lobby doubled its profits last year, and yet subsidies from wealthy governments increased. The IMF is releasing data showing that the fossil fuel industry is getting $13 million a minute of public money to continue to expand. And we wonder why the markets aren't constraining supply. The markets will not save us. And if they continue to rely only on demand reduction and on the markets, then there will be no justice. because there's no equity inherent in the marketplace. The marketplace is not going to ensure that we stay within a global carbon budget. Today, every decision, every ton of carbon that we save from going into the atmosphere will save lives. And what we build today is what we will use tomorrow. And that's why we need a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty to stop expanding the problem. Thank you.
I'll be brief. I think what today showed is that the era of countries claiming to be climate leaders and not bearing any consequences when they keep expanding fossil fuel production is over. That era is over. I think it's become very, very clear in climate diplomacy now that if you do not constrain your production of oil and gas and coal, you do not get a seat at the table when it comes to climate leadership. That's new. It seems obvious now, but even just a few years ago, that wasn't the case. We were talking about it right before this press conference. When was the last time the United States was not invited at a global summit on anything, any topic? So things are changing, and I think these countries need to think long and hard about their international reputation. The countries that were not invited this morning, they need to think long and hard about their international reputation, because it's only downhill from here as long as they refuse to phase out fossil fuels.
I think three key messages. One is, if you're not a forward-looking leader that is looking for the best interests of humanity, you have no place at the high table. If you're backward-looking and a climate vandal who is strengthening, our future and our prosperity, you have no place at the high table. And the choice we have is one where we can have a managed decline in the production of fossil fuels, where we have a phase-out date agreed internationally that is also fair and equitable, affording opportunity, particularly to the most vulnerable, so that they can be able to transition away from fossil fuels towards the renewables in a managed manner, or a disruption. When all of us realize we're in a climate emergency, we will then have to close the taps for fossil fuels. The opportunity we have now is work towards an international cooperation that helps us wind down fossil fuel production and effectively scale up renewables. And that choice has now been made clear, and the direction of travel for the world has been made clear in New York when we failed in the last 35 years of negotiations. And then the final word I wanted to make is on the backward-looking announcement that the UK made today. The climate crisis was birthed in the UK. Through the invention of the combustion engine, the path that the world has taken that has caused the climate crisis was birthed in the UK. And in 2021, through COP26, the UK was the place where the world agreed to phase down coal and phase out fossil fuel subsidies. And it was also the place where the world agreed to end fossil fuel financing. And the UK was the first country to put forward a net zero 2050 plan. And now you have a leader who is backward looking and who is effectively wanting to actually toe every climate policy that the UK agreed. What I want to say is the action of Rishi Sunak is disgusting betrayal of the climate vulnerable people of this planet. It's stupid, it's cruel, and it's actually vandalism on the UK. And I think it's important for us to send a clear message to the UK that he has no public mandate, he's playing politics, and is actually going to backfire. The direction the UK and the rest of the world, through the people's opinion, is clear. We're moving forward together in solidarity to phase out fossil fuels, phase in renewables, provide solidarity to the climate vulnerable, and Rishi Sunak cannot hold the world back. Just like he didn't get a place to speak to the world in New York, his message is not going to come through. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you, everybody, for your time today. Our speakers may be available, so please approach them if you'd like to talk to them. And we also have incredible youth speakers in the audience from California, the United States, and the Pacific Islands. So please, for reporters, feel free to reach out.